Well, welcome everybody to another exciting Microgiants meeting. And today we have our panel with us, John Mills, John J.P. Beal, and Ed Lasik. And behind the scenes, we've got Edgar Martin, who will we assume be on here as we wrap up for the comments. Today's going to be a different in a way, this is a wrap up because we've been talking about the marketing process, how to design it, how to analyze, how to redo it, and do the cycle. So we've been talking about that all along for some time now, and we've talked a little bit about media and a little bit about how do you write the message. And this is sort of an advanced version of doing messaging. And we're going to get into some kind of new things here that will include some of the brand new science that is happening in neuromarketing today. So we'll go ahead and get this thing going. And I think it will end up being a little bit different than what some think a message is about. Welcome to Microgiants. Basically, we have already talked about most of these elements. Company positioning, of course, you've got a positioning statement, and then targeting. And then we've talked a little bit about the target personas. These are the individual people within a target. So in this particular example, this happens to be a business-to-business company that is targeting people for industrial work. But within their group of people that they're targeting, they have different personas who are decision makers. So for example, in this particular case, they've got professionals, purchasing agents. These are the people that sort of sign the work order or sign the contract, depending on what level of business is being done. And they're kind of watchdogs to make sure that everything is really right. And they care a lot about the price and meeting a budget and what the value that their company is buying and what the dependability of the product is. Then you've got the owner who may or may not be involved in the purchase, but they're in an entirely different place. They started the business for potentially different reasons than they hired the professional purchasing agent. And so they many times are interested in the efficiency of the product, the prestige it may bring to buy a certain brand, or the cost savings, etc. And then you've got, in technical things, you've got the engineers. And there we want to write to quality, accuracy, longevity, reliability. So you can see that you have in a single company, you've got 3 different people to sell to. Well, what does this mean? This means that you're going to write communications that sell to each one of them individually in an ideal world. Now, you can't always get that done because in the olden days, if you're sending out a postcard, you're just sending out one card. You got to catch somebody with the right message. Today, when you can target individual personas, you can change the email to each one of these different groups. It means you need to know more about them. So we're going to kind of dig into that just a little bit. So I said owners they start the business many times. They did it because they wanted to be independent. They wanted to fill a market niche that they had discovered because they're already in the industry. They tend to have more of an emotional kind of reaction because they've done this for different reasons than the people that they are hiring. And many owners have personalities that are more gregarious and they're open to change and they've got new ideas. They have to hire people who are more technical in order to sort of satisfy that part of their business. Engineers, then, on the other hand, as you can imagine, they get satisfaction from precision, seeing elegant solutions brought to a problem. They want quality because they don't want to have issues down the road. So they're making their decisions based on something entirely different than the owner may, even though they might say they're looking at the same things, and they are in many cases. But the engineer doesn't want to make a mistake because they don't want to get fired. It's a different mentality. Professional purchasing agents are really focused on budgets. They know what their budget for the year is. They know what they think a machine might cost or repair, whatever it is they're buying. They've done a lot of purchasing. They know a lot about pricing. They know a lot about contract terms, etc. So they're coming from an entirely different place. They achieve success when the purchase comes in under budget and is delivered on time. So you can see you've got three pretty different personas to sell to. Well, how do you get down to this? How do you really dig into these things? And so it really comes from three places. It comes from our individual levels of perception, how we see things, what our physical capabilities are. That includes touch, vision, smell, etc. And then there's also personality, which is wrapped up into this. We tend to control ourselves and make decisions based on certain personality attributes that we have. Many times, if our personality tends to be sort of on the, we'll just use the word norm for now, or say on a bell curve, you're fitting kind of in the middle, you may not see a lot of difference between, say, 2 or 3 different people particularly within the same job in a company, but there are those elements that can cause where the personality causes a different kind of decision, and that personality needs to be catered to in a different way. But that is definitely one of those levels. Then you've got the semi-conscious or subconscious world. And this is where things get really interesting. First, let's just kind of review personality just briefly. We've done this in other programs, but I just want to kind of refresh for everybody that there are basically 5 big personality traits that are recognized by psychological organizations and so forth, and psychologists, and some people call them the ocean ones because it's OCEAN, and it helps you remember that the 5 are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, on each one of these, there's a pole. They call it low score, high score. I'm not sure I buy that. It's really an extreme one side to the other. So if you happen to be very open, which many owners and entrepreneurs are very open, they tend to be more over on this side, which they call high score. But if they're curious, they're open to change, they have varying interests, and they tend to be very independent. The opposite of that on openness is really very practical, what they would call conventional. Really likes routine, doesn't want things out of place, doesn't want surprises. So that's kind of the range of openness. Then you've got the same kind of a range on conscientiousness between impulsive and hardworking and dependable. An extroversion, those who are quiet, and we all know people like that, and those who are outgoing and warm. So you have those differences. And then agreeableness, where some people are very critical and suspicious. Those make good controllers. They make good purchasing agents. For instance, you want someone who's always suspecting that they're going to get screwed so that they can protect you and make sure the contract is right. On the other hand, you've got the helpful, trusting, empathetic people. They make great nurses and doctors, and they're not the ones that we would necessarily want checking the P's and Q's on your contract. And then you have neuroticism, which is kind of a different thing. It's a personality trait like the other 4, but this can cause people to act in profoundly different ways based on whether they tend to be very anxious and happy, or they're calm, even-tempered, and secure. So the level of neuroticism can actually change people's ability to or how they make decisions. Then we have perception. we've talked about perception, and so we're really not going to spend a lot of time on it here again, but this is one of the examples we used where you look at that and you go, did you see faces or did you see goblets? And then you'll remember this one. Do you see an old woman and an old man, or do you see the younger ones, the man here, the woman here, or do you actually see, the woman standing in the door versus the bottle over here? And then in addition to that, you've got the goblet, which is between them. So you have four distinct levels of imagery there. Not everybody sees every one of them. Some people don't only see one. Some people can see all four because they can switch their mind back and forth and see each one of those things. So there are different levels of perception that each one of us have. Then we run into neuroscience. This is interesting because neuromarketing is really what's going on today at the really serious marketing level. And this is happening because in an MRI, you can take a look at the activity in the brain and you can see that there are different levels of activity based on different kinds of decisions or different kinds of stimuli. And they occur in different places in the brain. And we know enough about the brain to realize that the brain has various different parts. And as a result of understanding more about it, sometimes there are silent motivators that cause us to make different decisions than even we think we're making. So, and this is where the message now is going. How do you write a message that can, along with personality and perception, can really influence someone's mood or behavior towards your product or purchasing, or the attitude about your product? And how far do you take that? Many of these are not really noticeable because they take place in what's called the old brain or the reptilian brain. And that is the base of the brain that is, well, closest to a reptile. And that tends to cause automatic reactions that happen without us really thinking about it. For instance, a startle response will cause people to, will actually happen in such a great degree that it never even gets to the conscious brain. You don't have any time to think about that. When you touch something that's hot, your action happens faster than your brain can think about it. It doesn't even know why you responded. And there are lots more of those kinds of responses out there too. Marketers are studying these things. And then we want to think that the frontal cortex, the part that does the thinking, really is responsible for reason and rationality. But the interesting thing is that sometimes in marketing and decisions, we don't have time to think. We just respond. And we respond based on different parts of the brain. And so it's important to understand what some of these kinds of things are when writing the message. Sometimes our body reports a physical stimuli, and it can be balanced by rules that are made by the prefrontal cortex. So that prefrontal cortex can rule it, but it's because the rules have already been put in place prior to the stimulation. So what causes this? What do we know about these causes? Well, dopamine is the primary reason. There are several chemicals which can be released in the brain for various reasons, and the chemicals can turn from one thing into another thing. So it's extremely complicated. Some people have said, this Dr. Andrew Huberman has said that dopamine is the only currency in the world. What does he mean by that? Well, he's basically saying that beyond money, the only thing that matters to people is dopamine. And so that sort of brings it right down to the basics. When people can choose any stimulation, meaning drunkenness, anger, sex, the winner is always mild frustration. Why? Because anticipation of what comes after frustration releases dopamine. So what happens to us is that we are tackling a problem, we're getting closer to the solution, we're about ready to say complete the task, and just before we check it off of our list, that dopamine is released, which gives us that sense of accomplishment. Well, that's the kind of thing we're dealing with when we're trying to write messages about products. So when we're deciding to buy, we have to determine, do we want it or do we not want it? And if we do want to buy it, then the wanting it releases the dopamine. Once we come to the conclusion we're going to buy it, the prefrontal cortex then projects, anticipates, and decides. But as I mentioned, it creates these rules that can alter some of those decisions. In other words, if you decide you're going to diet, that can alter the way you think about having that next Coke. It's like your brain says yes. Why? Because it craves sugar and creates energy in your brain and perhaps dopamine. I'm not sure about that. But if your rules have already been set up to say, I can only have one a day, you can stop yourself from the craving or stop yourself from that decision mentally. And so you do have the ability to alter the old brain or the emotional responses with the rules if they've been created ahead of time. And then personality, getting back to personality can actually have something to say about those rules. So if you're neurotic, you may have less capability to be able to do something about certain things. On the other hand, if you happen to be very utilitarian, you've already set up a certain amount of rules that help you achieve certain things, say on your list for the day. And when you achieve those things, you mark them off and you get your dopamine reward. And so your personality can set these rules up. And so what you're also dealing with, not only you're trying to sell your product as a valuable or good price or high quality or terrific post service, whatever you see the features of your product that you're trying to sell, you also have to be cognizant of these different levels of decision making in order to be able to do the best job in setting your product up, positioning your product, and then getting to the place to where people actually do make the decision to buy. So we have one other level here, which complicates this decision process just a little bit, and that is that when you're anxious, everything defaults to simple. What that means is that your old brain takes over and you begin to integrate the rules that you've already made a decision on, or not, if you haven't kind of gone down that. But typically, quick anxiety like fright, the logic tends to block unless you've already got some training or decision-making process in place. The interesting thing here is that the anxiety can create adrenaline. Adrenaline is a byproduct of dopamine. So you know that adrenaline can energize you. So when you have a cognitive goal and you have that little shot of dopamine can turn into adrenaline, which gives you the energy to take on that next task. So it's a very interesting way to motivate yourself. It's an interesting way to consider motivating a customer to go to, say, the next step of the sale, that sort of thing. And so all of these pieces working together. And so My point here in bringing this sort of sophisticated level up is to say there's a lot more to writing a message than meets the eye, I guess. And so as a result, you want to know a lot more about your customer in order to be able to write a good message that actually achieves what you're trying to achieve. And so the brain being as complex as it is, and our personalities being as complex as they are all stimulated and influenced very heavily by the release of dopamine and some other chemicals. I'm simplifying this a great deal. And so those are the kinds of things that you need to attempt to understand, which is why you learn about people's personalities. It's why you learn about what motivates different kinds of personalities, and think about the features of your product in a way based on those personas. So I thought what we'd do here is maybe just have a little bit of a discussion. I thought I'd throw out a couple of examples to get us started. One of them is the many times the first impulse is to say, "Oh, come on, that can't be true. I've got complete control of myself." But science has now really shown that we don't have as much control as we think we have. So, for instance, when you've got a bottle of fine wine, and someone tastes that, and they know what they're going to taste, they automatically end up having a satisfactory dopamine release, and they like the wine. Well, the interesting part about that is that if you do a brain scan, you can prove that the person actually did enjoy that wine. But if you change the wine, the label on the wine, to what you think it's going to taste like, but it's not the real wine, you get the same brain reaction. In other words, because you expect it to be good, you in fact enjoy it anyway, even though it's not the same wine. So, John, you're smiling. Is that because you believe it or because you don't believe it?
Well, yeah, so it is interesting. I think drinks are very interesting. Why some people like sweet tea, other people like hot tea, cold tea. Um, yeah, there's an element of truth in that. And I think part of it with the alcohol is a little bit different. And that is, I don't know that we're expecting the taste or we're expecting the effect.
Oh, it could be both or one or the other. Yeah.
But I'm thinking, the first glass of wine, then when you've had two or three glasses, and if you happen to have had more than that at some point, I think the quality of wine is less perceptible.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's probably
Yeah.
true.
But actually, I was thinking about product, and I don't know whether you can see this. Um,
Yeah.
so this
Looks
is
like a
something.
drive.
Well, it's actually not. This is a Sony MP3 player,
Oh, okay.
and it's probably 30 years old. And it came out with a little button here for forward and a little button here with reverse, um, and it had a screen that showed the song that you're on, and it's very smooth. And I
Mm-hmm.
was when I first got it, you plugged in your 3.5 millimeter right in the end here, and it feels extremely nice. This is one of the nicest products that I had used, loving audio, until the iPod came along. If you remember the iPod back in the day, I think it was the
Oh,
iPod.
yeah.
And they came up with a very slim thing. And part of it was the feel of these devices. It had nothing to do with the quality of the sound, but they felt very nice.
Mm-hmm.
So all the time as you're describing this, Apple, Steve Jobs somehow made a decision that here we are producing an audio product, but the tactile feel was going to be a sublimely nice experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, they set the standard. And I'm not a big Apple fan. I mean, I have Apple products, but I'm not an Apple maniac. There are some people who just swear that Apple's the only thing to do. But I like their products, but you know, but then they came out and they put packaging in, and the packaging was so good. I mean, it was the original packaging of the iPods back in the day when they first came out. I mean, it was far more sophisticated than anything else that was going on. You want to address that at all, you guys?
Well, yeah, as you know, one of the things that I ran across in doing research in neuroscience, it's a subject I've been interested in for years, but I've had a lot more time in the last year or two to spend more time researching it. And one of the things that popped up was the Apple logo creates creativity in those people who use Apple products. And you're gonna go, wow, what is that? That's crazy. Well, but no, the truth is that the neuroscience comes up and basically says that seems to be true. People tend to be more creative when they're using Apple products. And so why is that? Well, part of that is because they, you know, Steve Jobs started the whole Think Different campaign in 1998, I think it was. And so when they started, they differentiated themselves to the point to say, look, we think different. We have different kinds of products. You can think different, and if you use our products, you will actually be able to think more differently. Well, see, the people who they're selling to are the personality types that are open to change. They are the creative types. Those are the ones who are actually stimulated, and they're open to ideas, and so they're stimulated to do better, and perhaps they really do better. Perhaps they get a little charge of dopamine just when they open up their Apple computer. Perhaps that helps them design. But the interesting thing is that we thought this for a lot of years, and psychologists would talk about it. Behaviorists, marketing behaviorists talked about it, but now neuroscience is showing that yes, there's some truth to this. So when you talk about the feel and the touch, that's all absolutely the case. But I think what I would suggest is that that doesn't mean that the rest of us would have the same feeling about that product. You know, Ed being a much more utilitarian might think that's the stupidest thing in the world to actually consider the touch of the product as having anything to do with the quality of the music. Now, and Ed's a musician, so he's actually more creative than I give him credit for. So, but you know, he might have that because he's set up a certain amount of rules that basically say, don't let your first impression necessarily make the decision for you. You got to be a little more investigative or whatever. You know, I mean, we all make up some of these rules based on our personalities and in our interpretation of the world and how we want to be. And so sometimes they get in the way. So the question always boils down to is, okay, that probably worked well for people like you, John, but it may not have worked well for other people who don't have that same personality type.
It's kind of the Nike swoosh from the last video, isn't it? All athletes belong here, or this is your home if you're an athlete. I forget exactly what it was.
Yeah.
I mean, if the sight of a treadmill sends someone like me into fits, is it dopamine? Is it a dopamine rush, or is it a different chemical at that point?
Well, and couldn't it be both? I mean, you see the logo, and if you associate athleticism or exercise or whatever that is, that may actually get you up off your duff to go do something. And so we now know that, well, if you get that little shot of dopamine, you can turn that into adrenaline. And so here you go. You just put on your shoes and you're ready to go. You see, especially somebody who gets that, whatever that runner's high is, whether I suppose that's dopamine, whatever that runner's high is, that you're out there, you take a few steps, pretty soon you're going, oh wow, not only did I anticipate this happening, it is happening to me for real. Why? Well, you don't actually think, oh, I got that dopamine rush, but that may be really what's happening, and it's conjured up based on an image. Isn't that amazing when you think about what an image can actually do.
Is there anything in the studies that talks about sort of the impact of opinion on it? Like, say you're an oinophile like Richard Paterson with the $1 million nose. I mean, are you getting more dopamine from that glass of wine than, you know, John Q. Public? And I mean, suppose you're teetotal and the idea of wine is abhorrent. I mean, is there sort of a spectrum of degrees on the impact, or is it binary,
Well,
like you get it or you don't, or you
no,
get it
I think
universally?
there's a spectrum. Yeah, there's a spectrum. I can remember I was brought up in a household where there was no drinking. And
Hmm.
you know, I mean, and my parents' friends didn't drink. I mean, I didn't know any, you know. So I remember walking past a tavern and smelling that alcohol waft come through,
Hmm.
and my mother saying, "Oh, isn't that a horrible smell?"
Huh.
And so I'm thinking, well, alcohol smells really bad, and it's really not good for you. And you know, and literally, I mean, I went off to college with that sort of an attitude. Fortunately, college broke me of that. So, but I mean, you know, I had to relearn smells. What what is the anticipation? Um, you know, it used to be that you might smell alcohol on somebody's breath, and people would just be, "Oh my gosh, did you smell the alcohol in his breath? It's only 1 o'clock." I mean, and I don't think that happens anymore. Um, at least I haven't been around anybody who's said something like that, and that's probably because I'm around a lot of drinkers nowadays. I don't know why, but you know, so I do think that we have the ability to mold to mold some of these attitudes, and they're based on a certain amount of feedback, and you can change and mold your conscious mind so that your reactions to your unconscious, some of these unconscious stimuli, can be changed. It's whether or not we have those rules in place or not. So, you know, when you're thinking about someone who enjoys the wine, they're enjoying the wine practically before they taste it because they've associated the bottle and the label with that particular wine already. And they've learned that, and they've told themselves that they love that. And drinking it is only a matter of reinforcement at that point. So, you know, do they really have the taste to understand the difference? I don't think we can. This is one of those philosophical questions. None of us can know what somebody else tastes or smells. We we can all identify a skunk smell, but is it really the same to all of us? I don't know. Or do we learn that it's a horrible smell? And it maybe is different now since COVID. Certain foods taste different to me than they used to.
Hmm.
So I'm convinced that our sensory apparatus can be damaged and can change a little bit. You know, I used to love Cheerios. I can barely eat Cheerios now. So
Really?
where did that come from? You know, so that's pretty strange. So you know, I think things do happen. You have a different receptors that can cause these changes, but by the same token, we are also very malleable, and our brains
Hmm.
can rethink and change the rules so that we adjust to things. For instance, I'll never forget seeing this guy in the University of Colorado campus walking around campus with a pair of uh, well, they were like binoculars, except instead of regular glasses, they had prisms on them, and
Hmm.
they ended up being a little bit more like periscopes. Well, they were causing him to see everything upside down. In
Hmm.
5 days, his brain adjusted so that he could see everything right side up. And so you could see him wandering around, staggering. 5 days later, he's walking as if he was normal, and he's recognizing you. but then he takes them off. It takes 5 more days for his brain to switch back to what was normal.
Huh.
So you see how malleable our brains really are in handling injuries and changes in sensory perceptions, etc. And so the whole thing is very, very complicated, and we think that we're in a lot more control than we really are. And so that's why it's important to really think about, when you're, in marketing, what are you really selling? Is it the widget that you're selling, or is it the confidence that the widget will work? Is it the aesthetics of the widget, including the look and feel and sound, or is it the practical delivery of, say, the product?
Maybe it's both.
Well, I think it's a combination, and not only is it both and all, it's different for different people. It makes
it is really
marketing difficult.
right, because you're having to speak to sides of a person that don't really necessarily have a voice. Like the reptile brain seems to really react strongly to these experiential stimuli, to smell, taste, touch, and those have strong linkages to memory. That's sort of a principle inside my business. Is I'm selling the flavors and fragrances that people have strong memories attached to.
Right.
But so at that point, like, the logical, well-reasoned argument doesn't necessarily make good advertising at the end of the day, because what people remember is how something made them feel.
And that's exactly right. Exactly right. There's recent evidence that in an article that I just read this last weekend, that certain kinds of aromatherapy can actually enhance memory in older people. So, there may be another level beyond what we're even, discussing, but clearly, smell is one of the deepest possible memory conjutators, that there are. And I can remember when there's a certain perfume that when I smell it, which is not very often, but when I smell it, I remember the date of the girl that first wore it 50 some years ago. It's sort of like, how would you remember that? Why would you remember that? And it wasn't the girl, it was the fragrance. I think, yeah. I'm not really sure, but you have, and especially in your business where fragrance is a big part of it, you kind of have to study what fragrances mean to people in order to know how to build the fragrance. How do you even build a product unless you understand what the people responses are? Now you take that to another level. You get into the dark side of all of this stuff. And I guess with AI, there's also a dark spot in neuromarketing. And that is that they're getting so good at some of these things, including flavors and smells. The food people are so good that they're creating a desire and a dopamine feedback loop that is so strong, people can't stop eating certain things. So you wonder why we're overweight. It's because our food industry, our packaged food industry, has gotten so proficient that they've actually hooked us psychologically and chemically on their products. There's, again, since COVID, this isn't the case anymore, but I used to really have to use my willpower to stop eating nacho Doritos. I loved them. And it's like, you unconsciously just keep feeding yourself. And you have to kind of say, wow, half of the bag is gone. What is wrong with me? I've got to stop this. And now since COVID, I don't have that instinctive desire to continue to eat them. I eat a few, and it's sort of like, it doesn't mean as much anymore. I don't. So in a way, I guess I'm brain injured because of that. So, but I mean, it's really an incredibly powerful thing, to the point to where there's beginning to be some discussion about, do we need to begin to monitor, watch, and maybe even legislate against marketers learning so much about us that we are making decisions based on their marketing cues, and they're not even our own decisions anymore. That's a frightening thing. I mean, it's from both sides. It's like, gee, it'd be nice to get people to buy my product, but on the other hand, do you want to go so far as to get them hooked on whatever it is? I mean, are you in the Dorito business, or are you in the drug business? What are you really doing here? So it gets to be a little bit strange. The Going back to Apple, there's an interesting backside to that, and that is that the Apple people are the ones who believe they're more creative, but the Samsung people are anti-Apple people. They actually are buying against Apple. They're not buying for Samsung necessarily. They're buying because they don't happen to be an aficionado of Apple. So we're all in danger of being on the wrong side of that equation as well.
So, as the hapless Samsung user in the room, perhaps there are others, but and I can at least confess to the fact that the first Samsung I bought was because I wanted to switch from Apple, because I felt that I would be able to better protect my personal privacy. I wasn't sure that Apple wasn't going to be selling the sort of data that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
I have to say, since using Samsung, I've enjoyed the features that I've bought other ones since. But yeah, I mean, I guess I am one of those anti-Apple people. I use Excel far too much to be able to use a Mac, and yeah.
Well, I consider myself an anti-Apple person too, not because I disliked what Apple was doing, because I was one of the very first people to have a Mac, and I just loved it. But I loved it because of the ease of use and the features and that sort of thing. But when you could buy a PC loaded up with all the Microsoft software, and it could do 95%, not counting graphics, but 95% of everything else as good or better. My logical mind basically said, why are you spending 3 times as much for the same computing power? And it made me mad that Apple would take advantage of me to that extent. Had it been a 20 or 30%, maybe that would have been fine. Now, I was involved in business applications, and they were very weak in the early days on business applications. So that's part of it as well, because I wasn't really using that much of the graphic side or the educational side. But yeah, I share that sentiment, and I'm a Samsung user today. But then there's even more, partially because of my personality. I use Consumer Reports a lot. And Consumer Reports has judged Samsung in the top 5, along with 1 or 2 of the Apple phones, for years. So if you're taking a look at just the logical, straightforward, feature for feature, computing power, et cetera, not looking at money, Samsung has as good of phones as Apple does. And so then the next question is, well, why do people continue to buy Apple? You're spending a 20 or 30% premium in order to be able to do that. Well, that's because the Apple brand is so strong among those people, and they've done a stellar job with their branding. They really have.
That psychological engineering has a cost, but at the same time, I mean, if you get really refined on what your product means to people, that's a premium that you can command. That's bottom line.
Yeah. There are a couple of other interesting things as we sort of wrap up here in a few minutes, but one of the other things that I came across was Chick-fil-A, which is an interesting and a little bit controversial company right now. The Chick-fil-A is CHIC, obviously, and then FIL, meaning fill or fill up, and then A, which the A means quality. They built that name specifically because of those features, apparently. They are literally the third largest fast food restaurant in the country. Did you guys know that?
Oh,
That blew my mind.
yeah,
I think,
that's amazing.
yeah, it's because
And
of
it's closed on Sundays.
yeah, and it's closed on Sunday.
And it's the third biggest, it's third largest.
And so, yeah. And so what do
Wow.
they do? Their advertising is fun anti-cow. You notice their terrific ads of, don't eat, or no, it's don't eat chicken, eat cow. Why? Because, we're chickens here. Or is it, do I have it backwards? But the whole thing is just sort of a fun attitude. But they have a secret recipe, which apparently, that's not a place where I eat very often, so I can't say I know much about the recipe, but the chicken is good. But they have a secret recipe, which is, similar to Coca-Cola and some of the other folks who have recipes. But they've done a pretty good job doing that. So I think sort of any other comments before we wrap up here?
Well, Ron, what kind of advice would you have for a family-run business to get started understanding this new technology and how they might be able to use it to improve their bottom line?
Well, I think the first thing to do is just to kind of go back to the what I've found worked, in all these years, is to go back to the marketing planning cycle. And you start at the top with customers, and you begin learning about your customers. You start with the demographics, and then you move into psychographics, and then you move into the neurographics here. But you have to kind of execute. You can't just do everything 100%, because getting down at this level, say in profiling, is pretty sophisticated stuff. To understand your market segments at this level requires having spent a lot of time gathering information, a lot of relationships with customers, buying some data in some cases to try and learn a little bit more about their buying habits and that sort of thing, and then paying attention to your own advertising, doing the analysis. So, I mean, the whole cycle of what we've gone through here. So that seems like a tall order, and it's not a quick fix. But if I've learned anything in 30 some years of consulting with people on marketing, I've learned that there isn't such a thing as a quick fix. It's just hard work. And so I guess what I would say to your question is recognize it's hard work and spend the effort doing the hard work. And following the marketing planning cycle is a guide on how you can go through and do that and kind of keep yourself on track and get some things done, get started, and then you keep going around and around the circle, and you refine it and you refine it and you refine it. And by the time you get around 2 or 3, 4 times, you're going to get at this level that we are now, where you're beginning to realize, okay, we've got personas on people. Why are these people like this? And then you can begin to get into some of the neuromarketing stuff and figure out what those motivations really are. Some owners intuitively understand it now. They just get it. And I think especially say from the consulting side, when you're working with people who are still in business, they're still in business because they were successful doing some of this stuff. So a lot of times when a product has been developed, it's been developed by, say, an entrepreneur who recognized that there was a need, and they're able to sell to that need right away. And so they would take a look at, well, what am I going to do? You want me to do all this kind of stuff when I already know what I'm doing. there's a certain amount of truth to that. Sometimes they just intuitively understand what it is that they're doing, but they may not really fully understand the full market. And therefore, part of looking outside of yourself is to understand whether or not you ought to be engaged in adjacent markets or adjacent products in the same market, et cetera. So it's still good for them, but a lot of times they just, if they've made it for 5 years and they're 10 years down the road, that means they're making money and staying in business. So they may have kind of got it. The issue there would be, can the next owner get it? If it's a family business, does everyone in the family understand what the founder knows? That's where I think things can fall apart. It's like,
That's a good point.
how do you get that to the next generation intact? That's the problem with that. Yeah.
So it's a transition problem going from one ownership structure to another.
Yeah, I think maybe that may be where the issue lies, is just in the transition, really.
Very, very seldom I would imagine it's ever documented so that people can understand it. And that's a good portion of the goodwill of the company. It is the goodwill of the company.
I have one or two cases where it's understood, but it was because the positioning of the company was so embedded in the family, because it was so embedded in the owners and so embedded in the customers, that everybody knew. You go, okay, Nike. Does the next generation understand? Yeah, they understand, because it's so publicly known. Same thing with Apple. Who's going to try and change, all the wonderful success that Apple has had in branding? They may not be able to keep up technologically, but they sure should be able to maintain that branding. I mean, any next successor would be crazy to try and change that terrific success that they've had. And that's true with Coke and, all of the top brands. They've developed something that seems to be in the mind's eye of the customer already. It's where you try and change that. We've talked about Coke trying to emulate Pepsi and change the taste. When you try and change that radically, that's where you run into problems. Or Budweiser, they try to change the image radically. Wow, look how that backfired. Because Disney, same thing. Disney and what they've been known for, and then suddenly they switch into a whole new moral code according to their old family value code that has been around for 50 years. And now look at them. They're really struggling because people don't want to lose what they have had in Disney.
Actually, I think it's kind of apt, these observations though about sort of succession planning in the family business, because it kind of runs on a similar principle to what we were just discussing. In a way, it's how the business makes the next generation feel.
Yeah, and I suppose it's true not only just with family organizations, but it's true with everybody. You've got to always have that really deep understanding of who your customer is and how they feel about your product. And it's when you start trying to change that you can run into really serious issues.
So, Ron, like that brings up a question. I'm thinking that if you have a business that you actually have reasonable capacity and you're not looking to grow the business because you already have grown it, there's a possibility of you actually changing the client base that you've got over time if you use the right language and you provide the right services. So what I'm saying is a slight different situation than what we've talked about here in the last 5 minutes. It's like, okay, business is going well, but I really would like to have a more community-centric type of client base, and I desire to do these things. You could actually use the science to help over time change your client base. Is that right?
I think that's true, and you would use it to start with to determine if your client base would be willing to go there. I mean, there
Right.
you
So
could do
you've
the
got to
research.
you've got to establish, is it possible, and then if it is,
Yeah.
you can then fine tune it to reinforce that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think so. You could sort of test the idea before you go down that road, and then you'd be reasonably sure you could do it. For instance, if you had a changing population, and we've seen that happen. Buick, or was it Oldsmobile? This is not your father's Oldsmobile. I mean, what they tried to do is they realized that they had stuck with the father one generation, and the next generation wanted nothing to do with him. And so what they had to do is they had to try and actually transition to the next generation. Apparently, they didn't make it. They weren't able to transition to the next generation. I mean, they're gone, right? So, you know, sometimes you just can't get there from here. But I'm sure that there are lots of examples where that has gone from generation to generation. You know, if you take a look at, say, Betty Crocker. Betty Crocker has very slowly changed its image from a stay-at-home mom who was rewarded neuroscience wise, rewarded because she was a great cook and everybody really valued that. And as she went up and down the street to different teas, people would say how much they loved her muffins or whatever the case may be. So, you know, but over time, they've had to change that image quite a bit to the, you know, busy working mom who still values a home cooked meal or some cookies for the kids, even though she can't do it. You know, she's not making the 5 pies that her mother or grandmother made, but she's making one every once in a while. And so they've had to upgrade that image so that they didn't alienate the today's buyer, whose literally grandmother was the one that they started marketing to, or great grandmother. So, you know, they've apparently done a pretty successful job. But notice how incremental it was. See, it wasn't a big change, and it wasn't over a short period of time. It was a small incremental change over generations. So they've tried to keep that. So it's possible to do, but the cemetery is filled with a lot of people who didn't get that job done. Not that they died as a result, but I mean the businesses may have died. So, well, thank you. We've gone over just a little bit. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I thought it was sort of fun, and just another level to show really how amazingly complex this whole thing can get. So thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you all in a couple of weeks.
Well done, Ron.
Ron?
Oh,
Thank
Thank
you
you for everything. Sorry,
it's all right.
I missed the meeting, the half a part of it, the beginning part of it.
No problem. Did you get your stuff done?
Still on it, almost there. Hopefully done, and a few more